Okay, we have a first question from Grazia Pulvirenti, then Susan Keane, and third Thomas Petrashka. So Grazia, you go first.
Okay, thank you, Siri, for your very inspiring talk, and thank you, Christiana. Um, uh, I ask a question to Siri as a writer in reference to what Christiana said. I mean, Christiana was talking about the need to differentiate usual language in order to make it richer for what emotions may concern. But I mean, as a writer, literary language is a language which is totally different from everyday language. I mean, there can be kinds of imitation of natural language or
Yes.
realistic scenes, but the quality of language is a different quality, which has all the possible all the wider spectrum of emotions, just because it operates with strategies and techniques which are completely different from the usual languages. And as the first formalist said, the form is the content. So this creates a different condition in the mind of a writer, and the usage of language is so different, so that I have no need to underline that or underscore that that I need new metaphors and so on. And in any case, we were talking with Renata. Renata said all in all poetic texts of an author, there is a lot of reflection about how through the linguistic tools you can achieve such a richness. So Renata said, Goethe, if you read Faust from the beginning to the end, then you discover that for Goethe the smile is the key to all possible representations. So sorry for being too long. I hope it was clear.
This is really important. I mean, I think, speaking as someone who's written novels, speaking as someone who writes novels, I think what's interesting, you're absolutely right. And there is definitely conscious deliberation, for example, about how to move a story ahead. I think about that a lot, sometimes like Kleist, by the way, zoom, and other times very slow, taking, and really expanding on some encounter that, is important, but takes place in a matter of minutes in terms of the time of the novel. The other thing I do want to say, and this relates to Christiana's talk, is that the truth is, when you're working as a writer, most of this material that you're working with is not fully conscious, and you are not naming emotions. What you're doing is you're looking at the text in front of you, and you do this. You say, that feels right, or that feels wrong, and I have to write it over again because it's just not matching some really strange and organic idea. You don't say, gee, I woke up in the morning, I felt sad, right? This is not going to go over too well in a literary text, right? It's boring. So Christiana is absolutely right that kind of information inside a novel is not going to do the trick, right? You need something else. But where those words come from, I think, we are all penetrated by others. I mean, this is a little part of my thing. Voices come up. They are not necessarily summoned. They appear. Where do they appear from? Well, it ain't any conscious place that I can tell you. So the importance of, and this, of course, no matter, even in, cognitive science, very deliberate and not woo-woo, right? There's still the the cognitive unconscious. It's a big area, right? So unconsciousness, I think, has to be considered in these acts. It's not just propositional, I had that memory and now I'm feeling it. I mean, part of my discussion of Jane Eyre was that when I look back at my 13-year-old self, I understand that Jane Eyre was part of a process of pulling me into a place that I couldn't have gone if I hadn't had the book, right? I have different feelings for Jane Eyre now. I mean, I mentioned just one, which is the colonial racism that's part of it. But nevertheless, I think, we all want to divide the world into neat categories, especially in academic life. In fact, those categories have a tendency to blur.
Next is Susan Keen. Please, Susan.
Hello, both. Thank you for such wonderful papers. They talk to each other so well, and thank you both. My question is for Christiana, and it's kind of a combination of a supportive comment and a query. One is that in terms of the explicit depiction of mental states, there is, of course, a narrative theory vocabulary for talking about that. The most famous work is Dorrit Cohn's Transparent Minds, in which she describes psychonarration, narrated monologue, which is another term for free and direct discourse, and quoted monologue, which is sometimes called interior monologue. And what I think is that those terms would be very interesting for experimental investigation. And indeed, some of them, especially free and direct discourse, are already under investigation with respect to readers' empathy in manipulations of texts that have forms of mental thought represented in free and direct discourse, and those that have the same material but not represented in that way, to see if it makes a difference in the readers. But pertinent to what you were arguing, it seems to me that psychonarration, which is when the narrator is generalizing about the reader's mental state, that stuff has been around in narration like forever. It's in the old epics, and it's especially useful because it often uses metaphors and analogies to characterize what a mental state feels like, as opposed to just reproducing the words of the thoughts. That actually might elevate the importance of that mode, which is a time-honored mode. So that's just a sort of supportive suggestion about your ideas. But then the question really has to do with the idea of explicitness, because many readers, and I imagine some writers as well, think that literary depictions of characters in parasocial situations with one another would often get a workout in the reading of literary. The reader would get a workout in the reading of literary fiction by being asked to make inferences, to gather the implications of what the mental states of the characters would be like. The sort of most standard version of this would be the unreliable narrator, where the information that you are being given as a reader is exactly not what you are supposed to think is actually going on. So that the very often the very most literary experiences and the most intense experiences of responding to imagined others' mental states would be exactly the ones where it's not made explicit, where you're having to sort of put it together. So your Lego blocks are operating in some way without the key Lego block that actually says this is the thing that you're supposed to get to. So I just put that forward as a general query and a supportive suggestion, but both papers wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Susan. That's really helpful. And I mean, I haven't got much to add to this, because I absolutely agree. I said at the end that it would take a literary scholar to say more about how we come to that complex state we try to imagine as a reader. And I mean, all the mechanisms that take place there on the level of the text, I was very gappy there because this is just not my field, and I felt like I shouldn't try to say too much about that there. And I think that it does definitely makes sense not only to think about descriptions, either in a metaphorical way or something else, but also about the function of other passages in the text that are at least on the surface not about the character's mental state, but help us nevertheless to come to a bigger picture of what's going on in a character's mind. Yeah, thank you.
Next is Thomas.
Okay, thanks to you both. I actually have questions for both of you, but I think I will just ask Siri and ask Christiana later, because there's still a long list of persons wanting to ask maybe more interesting questions. So Siri, my question is just, maybe it's just a technicality or something. You were talking about quasi-emotions, right? And you were just, I wrote it actually, I noted it, quasi-emotions are nonsensical is what you said. So while in the end, I'm not sure, maybe I even agree, but I don't think I really got the reasons for your verdict on quasi-emotions, right? Because you were saying they ignore the corporeal dimension of emotions, and there are literally organisms in reaction to fictional characters and stuff like that, right? So what I wanted to ask, can this really be the difference between quasi-emotions and genuine emotions? Because if I remember Walton, who's the guy that updated this idea.
I read it, yeah.
Of course he did, yeah. But I think he actually claimed that the bodily reactions may be the same when it comes to genuine emotions and quasi-emotions, right? So the difference may be something like, there is no inclination to act. We don't act on quasi-emotions. We don't want to put flowers on Anna Karenina's grave. That's the example that's often there. So
yeah.
So Siri, what do you think about that? Should we?
I think this is.
What's wrong with quasi-emotions?
I think what I'm opposing is not just ignoring the corporeal aspect of feeling, and even more broadly, I mean, I have no solution to this, and it's just what I wanted to do was open the door to rethinking certain issues, which is, what the hell, for one thing, do we mean by psychology? Right? I mean, what the hell is the psyche? And if you look back at the old, at our tradition, the Western tradition, there's something really weird about this. But aside from that, so yes, so I agree that Walton could argue that, one could get, say, aroused by a fictional character. And the reason he wants to say quasi is because, it's not in the real world. I think making that border between the quasi and real emotions is not a useful distinction. What I think, and I mentioned it, and I've actually written about it in another essay, what I call the aesthetic frame, which is that inside that aesthetic frame, absolutely, and I mentioned it a couple of times, I know, first of all, that I'm not Jane Eyre, right? So subject object, very important difference. I know I'm reading a book, and I know I'm not going to change the story, right? My agency as a reader doesn't change it. So there are definitely overlaps between what Walton is saying, about caring for Anna Karenina and what I'm saying. The difference is that by framing it the way I'm framing it, there's no mistake about the corporeal roots of feeling. And that, I think, is something that in the analytical tradition has become extremely muddled, right? And the reason I bring up pregnancy that no one seems to want to ask me about and origin and cellular activity and mixing is because if our Western tradition paid as much attention to beginnings as ends, we might have a very different conception of what it means to have empathy, right? So, we're all start inside some other person. Merleau-Ponty, when he writes in his Unfinished, the visible and the invisible, about the flesh. He is so close to saying we begin in another person, but he can't. The tradition has elided all the possibilities of that. And that is the big argument here. I want to try to push that, you know, where do we start thinking about this question? If not at the beginning of things, right? We don't even know where agency begins in, you know, organismic life. These are big questions in the philosophy of biology. What is agency? What is biological identity? None of this is solved. So I am not sort of, you know, I'm an epistemological pluralist. I think there are lots of ways to know. But I've always felt my job as a marginal being, which I am, roaming around the outskirts of various disciplines, is to open up questions that weren't there to begin with. And pregnancy is surely one of them. It's been totally suppressed. Well, a couple of instances, but mostly suppressed. So I agree with, I think you're right about Walton, but I also think that making that distinction leads us to down roads that are non-productive. Does that make sense? A big answer to a smaller question, sorry.
Okay, I think it's my turn. Let me, okay. Well, first of all, I have a question for Siri. Thank you so much for your incredibly rich talk, and I side with Susan, beautiful and lyrical. My question deals with voice, the voice.
Yeah.
A question that keeps bothering me, and particularly so because I can't see ways of addressing it experimentally. Whose voice is the voice we hear when we read a novel? And I informally ask this question to many people, and you get the most diverse answer. People, I never paid attention. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, well, I wouldn't know. Or people in a much affirmative way, well, of course, is the character's voice. So sometimes I got answer from people who read a novel and then saw a movie taken after and they were totally disappointed by hearing the character speaking with the actor's voice that didn't match the voice they figured for themselves by silently reading. So you can hear many voices as a reader, but in the first place, as a writer too. So how do you relate with this question?
Yeah, I actually have read some studies about this, you know, what happens when people read. And my husband, for example, claims that when he's reading, he's actually hearing his own voice reading the words. This is just completely intuitive, that when I begin reading, I'm hearing something. And as I continue to read, it kind of goes silent. But again, is that true? I mean, I'm not sure. It's just a phenomenal experience. I know that when writing, as I said before, voices appear. I mean, it's a little like non-delusional multi-personality disorder. So what would that some voices come up and they seem quite coherent. And it must, of course, be out of memory of some kind. But it might also partake of the dynamics of dreaming, where you have, you know, consolidations of different people into one. You know, no one seems to be able to comment coherently on his, her, or their own experience of this kind of reading. I mean, I'm amazed by it. I've tried it myself. And I lose. Once I get to that place of absorption, I lose the self-consciousness necessary for me to evaluate what I'm actually hearing, or if I'm hearing anything. Right?
I have the impression that what you were discussing before with Thomas, and this aspect, losing control, losing agency, the two issues of the quasi and this about being so much absorbed that you can't focus on a specific voice. The two phenomena might be related somehow.
Yes,
it's
yes.
a feeling more than
Yes,
that.
so the distance perhaps necessary, or the reflective self-consciousness necessary for that evaluation isn't present when you're deeply inside a book, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Next is Jana Lütke, please.
So thanks again, both, for that really good talks. I have a specific question to Christiana and her idea that ordinary language might be not the best way to give some detailed information about mental states feel like. So when I try to come in contact to my participants, which are more or less normal persons, not trained in literary language, is there any chance to get an information by them about their mental states, what they feel while reading? So that's what we are interested in. But ordinary language is not able to convey that information, what we can do, especially in experimental research.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I haven't thought about that aspect of your work. Yeah, I mean, perhaps we have to accept that every now and then we will not get the full picture. So, but on the other hand, that means we do not need to be that pessimistic, because, of course, I mean, we have vocabulary to talk about mental states. It's just that it is a bit rough, and that for all of us who are not poets or professional writers, we have to, well, use what we have. And I think that it depends then probably on what we are after, and that for your purposes it might be then okay to say, oh, we just use a list of emotion words, and perhaps we have some, I don't know, common metaphors, or we start also to refer to bodily processes. I mean, every now and then when we talk about emotions, we start talking about our body as well, like raising heartbeat and how the skin feels or something like that. And this might help us, for example, to find out something about the intensity of. So perhaps we haven't got nice or very precise words to say something about the intensity, but by trying to go a bit like parallel ways, so to say, we might that might be a help. And I mean, there are some common metaphors which a lot of people probably agree on, that are often also related to bodily feelings, that emotions are often described in ways of going like, when you feel afraid, that you feel like someone's holding your heart in your hand, pressing it, things like that. I mean, I shouldn't start that, but because I'm not good at it. But I think every now and then we, even in everyday situations, we talk like that. And so I didn't mean to say there's no way we could get any sensible information out of a normal person about their mental and especially emotional states, but it's probably not as rich as it could be, and not as rich as we wanted it in cases of literary experiences.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Naomi Rocketness. Please, Naomi, go ahead.
Hello. Yes, this is perfect, because I was just going to talk about bodies. So I was going to offer some kind of response to Christiana, but by way of Siri's comment, that one of the things that literary writers do so well is not describe the emotion. The reader doesn't necessarily feel afraid because they're told that the character is afraid. The reader feels because of the atmosphere of the red room, of the terror, of the... So also through the language and description of the emotions of the character, mostly through the atmosphere, but also, which maybe hasn't been discussed much today, is bodies. So interestingly, the example that you gave earlier about the cook imagining the taste of cinnamon, and there's a lot of research that some people can imagine that really well and other people can't. So that kind of kinesthetic memory varies a lot between people. But one of the things that I've written a lot about this, people like Arundhati Roy or A.S. Byatt, or people who write very visceral texts, get you into the emotion, into the atmosphere, into the conflict, into the worries, whatever it is that they're trying to do by giving you tastes or sensations or shocking your motor system in affective ways that sometimes undercut, bypass, go way over any kind of linguistic or even conscious communication. So one of the wonders of literary text that a lot of it isn't in the specific definition of the emotion or finding a word that describes that situation, but getting the reader into that scene or that scenario or that constellation. So it won't be about remembering something that happened to you because you wouldn't have been in that situation. Right. Necessarily. I mean, maybe it's drawing on your past experience, but what very good writers can do is to bring you into a situation that you had never imagined, never had a conception of before, and yet you find that you relate, you resonate, you feel emotion, whatever. Anyway, just to say that thankfully, Siri, there are wonderful writers who already do this, and then there are lots of literary critics who write about it.
No, I mean, I find this totally fascinating. I mean, I didn't get there because it's, it really is sort of literary criticism. But of course, Jane in the room is Jane's body in many ways, right? And it's the child Jane. So that atmosphere of the room is very much, I think, about bodily reality, and the fear of the ghost. I try to imply this as a kind of erotic fear of penetration. So that's in there. But no, I think you're absolutely right. The way this is done, it's not by explicitly telling someone what the feelings are, right? And I have just this strange story about, it's not always drawing. I mean, I wasn't an orphan, right? I did not have, I hadn't lost my parents. I wasn't thrown into a room. I wasn't a 19th century girl. But Jane was a character that I identified very strongly with. I had an experience that I've never forgotten. After I published my third novel, which is a book called What I Loved, I was in Iowa giving a reading. That novel is narrated by a man. He's a Jew. He was born in Berlin, goes to London, and ends up in the United States. He's an art historian. After I gave a reading in Iowa, a woman came up to me and she said, "I have a message from you from my father." And she explained to me that he also had been born in Berlin. He had with his parents, stayed in London, and ended up, he was now in Florida. And I said, "So what's the message?" Well, okay, the narrator's name is Leo Hertzberg. And the message she gave to me was this. Her father said, "I am Leo." Think of that. Now, I'm not a Jew. I wasn't born in Berlin. I invented this guy. So what does that mean? I think we have to think about these kinds of imaginative transformations. Something about the book for this particular man answered something inside himself that made the identification very, very strong. It's a kind of an amazing story because it's a story about things that can happen in literature that aren't really explained at all by the experience of the author that somehow readers move into characters and identify very strongly for reasons that are not, about identical biographies.